I hope that's a fair statement, and has done so much to advance our knowledge and learn about the Algonquin peoples and the Chickahominy and the Powhatan chiefdom. She was a professor at ODU. She's the author of at least 3 books we have in our collection, which are on the side here to view. And at the same time, I'll introduce Chief Adkins, who is known to many of you, perhaps better than he's known to me. But I just asked Steve, and he started working on tribal recognition in 1978, and was the moving force in getting recognition for the Chickahominy in 1983, state recognition. And 40 years after that initial beginning, the United States government granted recognition to the Chickahominy and other Virginia Indian tribes. So it's been his life's work, really, to bring Virginia Indians, and the Chickahominy in particular, out of institutional obscurity and lack of recognition. As a child, he was born in Charles City, grew up here, and went to what was then the Indian School, Samaria. But to get a high school education, he had to go to Oklahoma and went to the high school run by Bacone College, and then went on to his college degree at Bacone. And that is, kind of part of the sad legacy of segregation in the South and in Virginia, that our children were divided and very much limited in their educational opportunities. But anyway, we're glad to have you here, and so fortunate to have these 2 very special people to present on the 400th anniversary of an event that sort of seemed to be Virginia was going to ignore. Thank you.
Do you have the clicker, or should I grab it? Assuming it works for me, sometimes it doesn't. I need to go back to. Nancy asked me if I would do a little bit of biography in addition, since back into obscurity went the promo I sent her. I'm a native of Hampton, so I wasn't born there. I was born in World War II, where my folks were stationed in Norfolk, Powhatan. So I have no memories of it. They left when I was 6 months old. I did my bachelor's degree at the College of William and Mary in sociology and anthropology, back before the flood. I declined to give you the date. Bachelor's degree in anthropology, began working with American Indians at the University of Utah, which is a state school, not a Mormon school, I do assure you. And then I did the PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. They had the one and only scholar on either side of the Atlantic as of 1970, when I was shopping for a doctoral program. The only scholar who was willing to supervise a doctoral dissertation connected in any way with Virginia Indians. I mean, the obscurity was real, no question. The year before, the Smithsonian had been trying to find an Algonquian Mid-Atlantic specialist for 3 chapters in their Handbook of North American Indians, which came out in '78. I wasn't even in the running at the time. Nobody else would take it. And so they went to Vienna, Austria, and found a fluent English speaker who had studied the historical Powhatan, the early historical. And that's where it died. Fortunately, we made friends. I don't usually pick enemies, I pick friends, and Christian's still a friend of mine. I have done, as of last July 4, I can't count anymore. I'm going senile. 10 university textbooks. The last one came out in July, and it is actually my version of invading North Carolina. I wrote about the Algonquin speakers in northeastern North Carolina, and they're the ones who met and absorbed the lost colony. Some of the illustrations you see here were done specially for the book. An artist hooked up with me after I failed to find one. She found me through the British Museum. They seemed to know who I was. That's nice. And she did a whole bunch of original paintings, as well as redoing some of the more famous ones by John White. I've used them wherever possible here because they're good village scenes. So that is the background. I'm going to be talking about, not just about the incident, the assault in 1622. I'm going to be doing what interests me. Sorry, gang. If you want to know how it was carried out and what the immediate aftermath was, etc., there are plenty of books that are out about it, including House's doctoral dissertation. Warfare does not especially interest me. Sorry, I'm a peacenik. What I'm going to go into is what probably caused the Indian people to react so violently to the continued English attempt to colonize them. I'm interested in why. So that is what we're going to do. And I hope I don't put you to sleep. The assault of 1622 is an assault. It was also a massacre, I don't question that. But usually when we hear of massacres, they're being carried out by Indians on other people, not other people carrying them out on Indians. There have been massacres by both sides. But the term assault is just so mentally laden with things. Fred Faust called it an uprising, and on semantic basis, I say that's not possible because they conquered yet. What are they going to rise up against? But as an assault, there's no doubt in the world that that's what it was, and it was a much larger scale maneuver on the Indians than they were usually accustomed to making. They did know how to practice, and they could do field warfare if they had to. They demonstrated it for John Smith during his captivity. But these chaps usually went in instead for short, small raids. So I want to know and tell you about why they didn't break the mold when they came very close to doing so. Raids that were usually quick, and if the defense against their enemies was too active, likely to be successful, the warriors would simply withdraw. They did not waste people. You don't take unnecessarily chances with your folks. This is who belonged to the Powhatan paramount chiefdom. By the way, it was not a confederacy. If one guy is running the thing, that ain't no confederacy. But all of these people were at least under Powhatan's influence. The closer they were to the James and York River, the more firmly they would be bound to Powhatan. And this also showed up in the Great Assault. The people on the Rappahannock and Potomac River mostly ignored Opie trying to pull off a Great Assault in 1622. They didn't have to fight, they didn't want to fight, and the Powhatans actually did well in advance announcement to the Indian world, at least, that they were going to be neutral. But by that time, the Opie and his brother, they do whatever they do, but they didn't want to get involved. They knew there'd be reprisals, and they were not in favor of getting raided themselves. This is John Smith's warrior account, and shows you how many active warriors were available to shoot at Captain John Smith in 1608. He was a military man, and he really wanted to know how many guys in any given chiefdom would be drawing a bead on him from the moment he arrived. Self-preservation. The actual populations, of course, were larger than this, but we don't know how much larger. One of the biggest tribes in the whole area was the Chickahominy. And that's because they had these wonderful freshwater marshes along the Chickahominy River, where you've got more marshes, you get more starchy tubers. Even if there's a drought and the corn crop doesn't come in, you can go out of those marshes and the Chickahominy is still going to be there. And if you've got lots of marshes, I call them breadbasket marshes. If you've got that, you've got no food, even in difficult years, and also in the spring, which is a hungry time, there's nothing much else growing, but those emergent plants are still there, and you know where they are. So over time, your population gets bigger. But even then, by European standards, these were not really, really big populations. And there's another reason for that. More food means more people, true. But if your way of getting your food is consistently not maximizing your agricultural crops and maximizing the animals you're raising on the farm, you're going to be foraging, and it simply isn't more profitable and less likely to produce lots of people. And that's why, what the background is, for doing raids and not taking chances with your people. It was the nature of their economy. It was easier for them to survive droughts. It made it impossible for the English to starve them out. You'd have to clear out all the marshes with a 1622 version of a bulldozer or a dredge. That might have damaged the Indian folks. But as it was, they could simply withdraw to parts of their territory where there was food and the English couldn't even get there. Right? So you got the warrior class. The ecological zones that people used, there were about 15 of them actually, altogether in Eastern Virginia. The only one that was not productive of food for people was the beach. The beach, especially ocean and bay beach, because it's just too dangerous to try to build a fish weir out there. There's no sense in trying to do it. We'd be blown away. Up in the highest part of the ridge, I understand it's called here in Charles City County. Geologically, it is a terrace that goes back about 400,000 years. But on the highest terrace, they left it in forest. And women went in there all the time. It wasn't just men's territory. Men went territory. The fuel with which food was cooked was firewood. Funny thing, the women and the children had to go out with firewood. So they're going to be going up there into that forest as well. In the nutting season, and you gather as many nuts as you possibly can. If wild turkeys went to contest it with you, you kill the turkeys and eat them. Very simple. But the nutting season was also a very major time of year that had whole families out. The corn growing is usually on the lowest terrace. It does not get readily flooded, but it does occasionally. And along the James and the Pamunkey, it shows better. Rappahannock had a beautiful correlation. No. You've got the, I also read a little bit, sorry. What you have got is your only chance in Eastern Virginia if you read the USDA soil surveys, which I have with a lake. That's where you get natural alluvial soils that have their fertility renewed occasionally. As you get closer to the bay, you don't even get that flooding. And so in my hometown of Hampton, there is no really good natural soil for raising much of anything. And it's doubly true on the farm where I grew up and where I live now. We raise poison ivy mosquitoes. In the freshwater marshes, you're looking at one kind of Chickahominy. That is called arrow arum, Powhatan virginica. Chickahominy probably meant a whole series of plants. They emerge from standing water, and they have got nice starchy roots. In the case of Powhatan, it is murder to dig. Which is why I have told people for years that the Powhatan women must have been built like piano movers. Because they were the ones that had to go get it. And then out in the river, you've got all kinds of shellfish, fish, and migratory birds coming through. And the women are going to get in canoes too. By the way, canoes, the family station wagon, so to speak, in those days, were used by women as well as men. It was not toys for overgrown boys. Because the women had to go and gather reeds to make mats, and mats were used for a whole bunch of things, but above all to cover houses with. And if the women didn't have a good way to get out to the reeds and transport them, they're surprisingly heavy on the way. When you get a great big bundle of them, I tried carrying one at Jamestown, and I nearly fell down. Now, canoe, women know how to do canoes. But all of these areas along the rivers were used, and used regularly, and considered to be under the stewardship of the native people. They didn't have fee simple ownership, and I will return to that little issue later, because it was a major spark that led to the assault of 1622. All right? One other thing, where you see the corn growing That's where the villages were. Waterfront property, extremely valuable to the Indians, and finally, our society has begun to make it popular too. By the way, our waterfront farm in Hampton was considered to be useless, absolutely useless, until after the folks bought the land and built the house, and then everybody wanted to move out and have a piece of it. But Dad had already cleared it, you see. Ah, lazy bums. Waterfront property. And it was in the middle of Indian people's territory. This is Apple Stream Valley. We have a mirror image on the other side. In Indian society, Algonquin speaking society, all up and down the East Coast. It's well documented for Connecticut, for instance. Rivers and watercourses of all sorts were considered centers of territories, not boundaries. But in European thinking, and in the thinking of most of the people in this country as a result of it, you use watercourses, nobody's going to live at water. Yeah. So that's your boundary. For a county, an electoral district, or whatever. Different thinking altogether. And the English and the Indians never really caught on to the difference. Instead, the Indians got converted to the English system. All you landholders take note. All right? The English were not well able to find out a lot of these mental attitudes, even once they had decent interpreters. Because very often, if you grow up in a system, you just learn how to navigate with it, and you don't think about it and what you're doing and why you might be doing it. And so if an Englishman had asked an Indian through a good interpreter, what do you think about land boundaries and all that? The Indian would simply go, what? And then we turn the tables to the Englishman and say, well, what do you do with land boundaries? How do you think about it? What do you mean? And chances are the Englishman, if it's an ordinary Joe, wouldn't have the faintest notion. Yeah, you don't explain yourselves to each other, because usually you're not able to. That is also going to be a major problem with the clash of religions, which is the last point I'm going to make later on. But peaceable ownership means that you own it forever. And that was how the Europeans thought about it. Indian folks were stewards, and once you cleared the field, yes, you could plant in it for your family, but after a couple of 3 years, you let it go fallow, and after that, anybody can come on it. I've actually done a sequence of native wild plants that produce food for people that grow in fallow fields. There's a regular succession of them. One of the most interesting to me is the stuff called silk grass. They wove baskets and occasionally garments out of it. It grows in the first year or two after a field is left fallow, and if you're lucky, there'll be quite a stand of it. It moves every year, unfortunately. But one year, we actually had on our farm about a half acre that was nothing but silkgrass stuff. All right? So when the English began taking up land, which is going to be the next little thing I should over to, when they began picking up land, the Indians assumed, okay, we'll use it for a while and turn it loose again. You're trespassing on my land. I'm going to shoot you. So we've got an automatic price share. So we'll go farther in the little issue of land. Forward. I knew it was going to do that. It did it over and over on Tuesday. Changed myself. This is a detail from Tabitha John Smith's map of 1608, published in 1612. And I know it's awfully busy. But just to say, you can get a feeling where the houses and the dots, meaning villages, they're all waterfront. And that turned out to be exactly what the English wanted. They not only wanted the richer land, which put them in the upper half of the coastal plain area of the James River, but they also wanted easy access to the rivers for shipping hot tobacco. So they had different reasons. They were sometimes using the rivers for fish and shellfish and so on. grew up with grits and grunts, corn and fish. And above all, you want to ship out tobacco traffic rich. That happens to me all the time. Battery short. There are some of our replica Englishmen, and they carried in their heads the attitudes toward land that were going to get them into deep doo-doo with the native people, culminating in the Assault of 1622. Let's do it. That's a Jamestown settlement. Here we are. The English, of course, had firearms and steel swords, which the Indians were dearly loved to have gotten and couldn't for quite a long while. The gentleman you see there, who is eating at home, has put aside his tomahawk. Bow and arrow and tomahawk is split. They fought with it. And it's not the hatchet-like tomahawk that you usually hear about. You see one that's supposed to be Virginia Indian, forget it, please. This is hardened wood, which can still split your skull quite handily. But it is nothing like as sharp and as effective as a steel sword would be. And so if you read your Captain John Smith, you will see all sorts of ploys that Powhatan himself tried to use to get some swords. Oh boy, do we want those. And as for firearms, yeah, in one of the aftermath things of 1622 was Obichankano managed to get hold of some captured gunpowder. He had no idea what it was, neither did anybody. The English did not let them see very much. And so he planted it in one of his fields, thinking it would yield food or gunpowder. So they really weren't much of a match in the pitched battle with Indian people. But the Indian people didn't resort to a pitched battle until very late. These are the English settlements, the number that you see, and the dark gray shade is where the very best corn growing land was, along the James River. It also coincides, a lot of you will know just from where you live, which is here, that the major old colonial plantations with the lovely 18th century houses were right on those lands. There's a direct correlation. Well, that's by 1630. The English were beginning to make their grab. Then Pocahontas was captured, there was a truce, and then the English really exploded over the landscape. Look how many more settlements they have. And that's within 7 years. You think the local folks weren't threatened by that? I really do. So that all by itself can make the English unpopular. They're not asking permission, they're not buying any land in it, either Indian or English way. They're just moving in. And making it stick because they had the gunpowder and they had the swords. Right. I reminded you all of that because the corn growing soil was also wanted by the English. It was the best soil for growing tobacco. And the English, by 1616, were getting really into what's called a cash crop economy. You put all your labor into one particular crop and hope that it brings a good price elsewhere. So the first place that those folks wanted was going to be those lower terraces. This also is a good illustration. It's the reason I really put it in there. If they took over the corn growing land and they decided that they were hostile to any native people who wanted to come through it, either to get into the forest or to get to the river, then you've got people who are literally cut off from the whole central part of the territory on any one side of the river. The analogy I'd like to use is you own a house, has a front porch and a back porch, of course. And somebody comes in and decides that they own the porches. And if you try to get out through a porch or in through a porch, they can get rough with you, if not shoot you. That's the analogy. Because the English didn't want any Indians even putting a toe on what they considered now to be their land. And it was a serious detriment to native people. If you want to go get some tuckahoe, sneak around the nearest settlement and try to avoid the English and then get to the river. And then you have to carry the whole thing back to wherever you were living. Eventually things got so bad that the Indians were living on swamps, which ironically fairly often had Chickahominy. They could survive in swamps the way the English could not. But just to say, that's a jungle in itself. You're taking a whole strip along a river as far as possible. It's very, very inconvenient for you folks. All of this competition, and not very fair competition, English for too long would outnumber the Indians. All that competition had insult added to injury in the matter of religion. The problem was not so much very different religions and different sorts of priesthood and that sort of thing. I did a journal article back in '96, I think, that actually traced the difference in Powhatan priests and English rectors. And I shocked the people of the Diocese of Southern Virginia, the Episcopalians. I'm one, been communicating with the diocese practically all my life. And they said, where did you get your information? I said, I got it growing up. But there were serious differences. What made it really bad, aside from not being able to communicate very well, was the English intolerance and insistence upon evangelizing. Evangelize. Back home in England, it was the respectable thing to do, to argue religion and argue that your version of orthodoxy was the only proper one. It was an ordinary topic of conversation every day. So, of course, they were completely used to it, and they had no idea how intrusive Indian people felt when they were assaulted that way, verbally. The best analogy I can give you, and I lived through this. Remember, I got my master's out at the University of Utah. I lived there 2 years. I remained an Episcopalian in spite of a lot of pressure, and even door-to-door sales. I found that I went to the U. Well, what are you majoring in? I didn't dare tell them anthropology because standard anthropology is anathema to Mormons. They know, they think that American Indians are lost tribes from Israel. They also do not teach evolution. They think that's a fallacy. Anthropology teaches both, that Indian folks came, namely from Asia, probably also some from Eurasia, from Europe. And of course, we're evolutionists. Biological anthropology has one major section of it that's actually human evolution. Amen. So when I was, before long, I learned how to, I'm off. I wouldn't say I'm majoring in, I said, I'm in music. And then I was taking clarinet lessons from the guy in the symphony orchestra. But I'd say I'm in music, and then I would start BSing about the Chicago Symphony. Because I had met a couple of people in it. Oh, so it is the insistence, the never-ending insistence on the part of the English that theirs was the only way. Powhatans were polytheists, and a bit like the ancient Greeks, that's what resonates with me. They talk about a certain person being a devotee of one god, and another person being a devotee of another god, and that really seems to have been the Powhatan attitude. You get to pick and choose, and nobody can tell you what to choose. When Pocahontas and the priest Untitled went to London, and Untitled was interviewed by a reverend sir of the church. They tried him. He said, can I convert you? Let me convert you. It's going to convert the young people who came with you. And Untitled says, no, don't bother. I'm too old to learn new ways. But go ahead. You want to go ahead and try them. It was easy going. But then this was a less complicated, much less authoritarian society that existed among the native people. And that doesn't go along with a lot of evangelism. So there were, in Indian eyes, the English were hopelessly rude. And plenty of them out west still think that. And I watched their attitudes toward various Christian missionaries, as well as Mormons. My Mormon friends had told me, but either way, they just said, why bother? We hate this. It just never lives up. Wouldn't it be nice for you to live with these people?
This is a religious man.
Yes, the last, that is a priest. Yeah. That is a conjurer. And both of these are, but this is a painting that Fran Harvey did for me for a North Carolina book. Neither in Virginia nor in Maryland nor in North Carolina can we be sure exactly how they divided up their labor or whether they divided it. But conjurers were known to do tricks and impress the people and keep up good PR. This is a conjurer on Bennett's Creek, which is a tributary of the Chewan River. And in 1705, he was reported as having taken a 2-foot reed in his mouth and ran across the surface of the water. And Ren and I both agree he probably had witnesses, so Ren drew in the witnesses. But this is an actual event that was seen by John Lawson. How he did it? Don't ask, I don't know. Don't know. All right. Well, with all these irritations and injuries, and of course the English felt that they would be held back, but didn't help. It's no wonder that the assault was so on a larger scale. Now he is looking at her boobs, but the guys in the back could be very well trying to evangelize the chief's wife who's come out to meet him. He's not there, so she greets him. But this sort of thing, and by the way, this scene is of a time that the English did drop in on the Indians living on Roanoke Island. They dropped in, they didn't give any advance notice. They took no notice, or probably didn't believe that anybody in the Indians would feel that they had to be feasted. And they're males, sorry guys, they're males. They don't have to cook up feasts. They figure it can be done fast. It just happens magically because the women are magical. Not in real life. Anyway, another clash. So you get a bit of nastiness. Just a trifle bit of nastiness. Right. But the surprise for Obi-Chandler, who led it, didn't turn out the way he wanted. He assumed that an assault that big would be, shall we say, a hint to the English that their presence was wanted to be elsewhere. Get out of here! Instead, the English sent for more people and expanded their settlements. Many of the houses in which settlements look like that. No beautiful Georgian brick plantation houses here. But they really, really began spreading out. This is, again, awfully busy, I'm sorry. But it is intended, I worked on the land patents to put that one together. It's intended to show that English grabbing of land started along the rivers and then went farther and farther up and farther inland. And by the time the place was pretty well completely full up, which was 1665, the English began pushing into the Piedmont as well, where they met some other people who didn't much like it. So with all of that, the Powhatans gradually pulled in their horns. Some left, some spun off into English society, usually younger people who were more flexible anyway, and still others stubbornly stayed in their own communities. But by 1705, we've got relatively few chunks of people. But that wasn't the end of it. They went on and they survived right down to the present day. Some of whom are here, and some of whom the other no. You're on, Steve.
Well, I got to take exception to one thing you said. I think my grandmother, my mother, my wife are magical women, so. But anyway, it's good to see you folks here today. I'm going to give you a little background that some of you may know, some of you may not know, but this march toward the west began when Pope Nicholas V told King Ferdinand of Portugal that the It's your God-given right to go to lands inhabited by savages or heathens, so that's his description. To take, put them in servitude, take the land, Christianize, and or kill them. And extended this first to the Portuguese, and of course, the British, the wealthy British. But then English, were a little jealous that were the Spaniards, the French, and others. So then he said, God gives us right to all of you to do this. And if you look at the destruction in its wake, where the Europeans went to Australia, where I've got some friends who are Maoris, they just devastated those lands and just left death and destruction in their wake. And when people say America was founded on Christian principles, then I can't disagree, because it was a Christian Pope that gave them a license to steal and kill and will. So that kind of set the stage for that migration to North America and into places hither and yon. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, a lot of those folks were British rule, India. It goes on and on and on. But so that's kind of a background. That started this migration. And if you want problems around that, just go back and look at 1452, the papal bull of 1452. But so we fast forward to the late 16th century, the late 1500s, when Powhatan was born in the 1590s. But the settlers arrived in 1607. We put this present day ships in. They came ashore mid-14, 1607. A scant 3.5 years later, Lord Delaware ordered the annihilation of the Powhatan tribe. It didn't matter gender, age. He wanted the whole tribe annihilated, because they had the dubious distinction of living closest to Jamestown, and he thought they may rise up one day and take over Jamestown. And if you look at Governor's Land at Two Rivers, that was Powhatan land. And it also went across the Chickahominy to what's now Morris Creek. So if you want to check this one, look at 17th century Virginia militia. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because the history of brown and black people hasn't been told. Nothing in the history books tell you about the massacre of the Powhatan tribe. I tell folks, I learned that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. It never came up on any employment interview that I had. It hadn't affected negative or positively anything in my life, but I was forced to learn that bit of trivia. But it wasn't important to learn what happened to the Powhatan. It wasn't important to learn that the first treaty between the colonists and indigenous peoples in 1614 between the Chickahominy tribe and the colonists. That I didn't need to know that, according to those folks who wrote the textbooks. But anyway, the Powhatan tribe, the annihilation was ordered by Lord Delaware. He gave explicit orders: don't bring any hostages. On the way back, he did have, and I'm glad Mama didn't name me this, but Chief Chickahominy. The Powhatan, his wife, they called her the Queen of the Powhatan, had her and two prepubescent maidens in the boat, taking them back. And as we get explicit orders, don't bring any hostages. So they threw the two boys in the river and blew their brains out. And the woman, they took ashore and said, we can't take her to Jamestown because they'll burn your state. So they ran her through with a sword. Now, people talk about history. History is like life. It's agony and ecstasy. And if you're going to teach history, why leave out those salient points that describe what was going on at the time? But the folks who put the history books together chose not to do that. So, fast forward to what we heard was the great massacre of the settlers by the native peoples. I remember going home feeling very, very sad about who I am. My people, and mom said, let me tell you the story. In the background, Helen wasn't as precise as yours, but she gave me enough to let me know he had nothing to be ashamed of. What happened in Warren? I have dear friends who tell me that their land holdings date back to 1634, granted by the king. I said, yeah, the king who stole it from the indigenous people. Now, I think it's pretty ironic that the rule of law came into place and fee simple titles, came vote. That happened after the land was snatched from us. There was no due process in taking land. They just took it because it could. And the king, the faraway king, just gave them charters to that land. But if you look at that history, look at the Treaty of 1614, and look at 1619, when the first English-speaking representative government was seated. And it's hard to call it because if you didn't own land, you weren't part of that. If you were female, you weren't part of it. So that first English-speaking General Assembly was landowners who were people of means. But a scant 20-some years after they sat, the Chickahominy and other people were displaced from their land to what's now King William County. You've heard of the Trail of Tears, 1830, Andrew Jackson. The only thing I like about him is a $20 bill, and I keep it face down. But we were forced. That was forcible relocation. And the Chickahominy are fortunate enough that we just acquired 944 acres on the Chickahominy River, which some say is the site of where the Treaty of 1614 was named. I don't know, but it is replete with history that supports the identity of the Chickahominy people. It's interesting that the oral history that we heard coming up has been validated through archaeology, through anthropological studies. As recently as 1978, I think, William and Mary exhumed Indian remains off the Chickahominy River, the place is called Bacon, and they came to the tribe in 1999 and said, look, we have Chickahominy remains, we think we need to do the right thing. So they now officially belong to the Chickahominy, and we will reinter them close to where they were exhumed. But with some serious misgivings, we allowed some bone fragments to be tested. And in fact, they're dated 600 AD. I remember working at DuPont. I was human resource manager, and people sometimes get angry with human resource managers. One folks said, I wish you'd go back where you came from. I said, well, 30 minutes I'm there. How long will it take to get back to Ireland? So. But anyway, that just kind of gives you a look at where we started, where we are today. 1646, if we fast forward, but during that interim, when we owned that land in King William, some of the land actually ended up in the hands of Thomas and William and Mary. I haven't broached that conversation yet, but it's on my playlist. But folks started moving back to what we call the Chickahominy Ridge. And I think it's phenomenal that Chickahominy people were able to buy land, fee simple, back then. You talk about obscurity. Some of it was, we wanted obscurity. We didn't want, we hunkered down for survival. You can't thrive in a survival mode. In most of that history, we were trying to survive. By 1699, 9 out of 10 indigenous people in this area had perished. 90%. I would say that the English lost a like amount numerically, but there was an inexhaustible supply and inexhaustible capacity or desire for land. I mean, a lot of folks thought, in fact, that this land was teeming with gold and other riches. So people kept coming. We could have destroyed Jamestown, but there would have been another and another. And quite frankly, it wasn't the way of the indigenous people to do all of that killing and dispossessing of land of the people who came in. You know, in my mind, I say when the settlers landed, the Indians saw this big ship compared to a dugout canoe and said, man, look at this. And then the folks come on, well, look at that weird clothing they had. I wonder, are they civilized? I mean, that had to go through their minds. So then you wonder, when people talk about civilization, civilized people, who, in fact, were the civilized people? Did it happen to be the natives, or was it the English who, 3.5 years after setting foot on the soil, destroyed the whole Indian village, women and children notwithstanding? If you fast forward to 1776, when the esteemed by many Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, one point he raised was the crown, the king, has incited these savages along the frontier whose methods of warfare don't distinguish between killing women, children, and men. That template was set, my friends, in 1610. And then in his research, Thomas Jefferson elected not to include it in that Declaration of Independence, because if you read it, you think we started that. As a matter of fact, the scalping didn't start, from our people. So, I got to go back a little bit now, but it just bothers me that the drivel that we are taught and that we believe, printed text taught in the school environment, you learn it whether it's fact or fiction. And history needs to be taught to capture the facts that occurred that built that history. If we do less, we in fact are depriving the students of history. I lectured at the University of Virginia for several years, graduate students, sometimes exchange students. And at the end of the series of talks, these folks were furious. Why didn't we learn this in school? Well, the simple answer is the dominant culture didn't want you to learn it. The idea was to keep us in our place. I tell people I'm old and bold and staying in my place and my lane is not what I want to do. Now, sometimes I take it to the extreme. My wife says, posted speed limit, that's not suggested speed limit, that's where you need to go. So, sometimes I take some of that license. But we need to perhaps not stay in our lane. The public right now is clamoring for truth, and we need to give them truth. And if you teach history, it's going to come out. Some of the lowest points in my life were when I saw my sister struggling with cancer. And I watched them die, I can't do that. But if I tell my history, and I don't include that, do you really know who Steve is? I would submit to you no. If you teach American history, the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and you don't bring all of those components in, the students are bereft of the true history. And you hear a lot of crazy stuff today, but all I want is history. And that's what students need. That's what we get paid for. So if you look at the tribe, my concern is truth. And I want us to know who we are. And I don't want to pit black against white and Indians against black. We're all made in God's image. My predecessors may in fact have been polytheistic. I choose Christ as the basis of my religion. It's fundamental to who I am. And I choose truth over fiction. So here we are back in the 18th century, around 1750. The Chickahominy are back here along Chickahominy Ridge, miraculously gained the land decent. And if you continue forward, we had to stay under the radar screen. We didn't want to attract attention to who we are, and that's survival. And Nansen did the same thing. The Mattapanaw, Monkey, Powhatan, Nansen, all did the same thing. Because that's the way we stayed together. Adversity could split, separate, and it did for some. Some of the Chickahominy chose to live as blacks, some chose to live as whites. We called it passing in those days. But in the late 19th century, several scholars have come through and they looked at the community. And we kept a loose-knit association as tribal people. And when reorganization occurred in 1901, we went from, that's where we chose a chief to be the leader of the tribe. Prior to that, we were ruled by what's called a Manga. There were 8 people who were chosen by the matriarchs. And those kids were picked at 12, 13, 14 years old. And they were removed from the community. They underwent rigorous physical and mental training. And the ones who didn't pass muster just disappeared. They didn't come back. They weren't killed. But their spirit was broken and they didn't want to come back and be perceived as faithful. But we were ruled by that kind of organization up until 1901. And when we reorganized the present day system, we have a method of electing chiefs every 4 years. And we don't use the electoral college. We think every vote counts. So you may want to put that in your thought process, maybe take it beyond us. And we've maintained that for since 1901, that chief kind of leadership. And when we were going for federal recognition through the administrative process, we had to show a footprint, and Helen can attest to this. Every decade between 1607 and when we finally got recognition, they finally changed that to where you had to show that relationship from 1900. The folks came into this area, Charles City, and to the surrounding Indian communities, and they said, folks, you need to really stop being so loosely organized and form a tighter relationship. And meetings were held, tribal meetings were held, but the formal note-taking wasn't done as religiously as it began to be, as those things began to be reported after 1901. We had minutes, Chickahominy tribe, tribal meetings continuously from 1900 through today. One of the sad things that happened was reorganization for all the tribes. For some folks, that the communities knew were Indians, were part of their tribal makeup, so we don't want part of it. We're happy where we are, we're living a good life, and we don't want to be on their tribal roles, and Helen has hurt us tremendously over the years. But that's the decision that the folks made at that time. They said, no, I don't want my name on the roll. I can imagine the heartache that family members felt when that happened, but that's a reality. And the Chickahominy tribe would be much larger today if those folks had chosen to continue to align with their tribal people. But we did undergo lots of hardships. Walter Placker in 1924, the Racial Integrity Act, was accepted by the Commonwealth. And that was part and parcel. I mean, it included this eugenics, pretty nasty point in the history of the Commonwealth. But the sad thing is the colleges and universities supported those people, those institutions of higher learning should have stood in the gap for blacks and for Indians, eugenics, all the things I'm talking about, that they didn't. And they embraced this idea of white superiority. higher level of intelligence than whites. They chose to perform medical testing on non-whites to accomplish an end that would say these drugs are safe. You can take those drugs, but the guinea pigs were people of color. Now that's not fun. You don't want to hear it, but it's the truth. We need to hear it. But as I was saying, it's sad that the colleges and universities let such a large part of their constituents down. They did not stand behind for us. You take it further, the executive branch, the governor didn't intervene. The legislative branch didn't intervene. And the judicial branch. They embraced what Walter Packer put down. And that was the wrong thing. It was against the law in 1935 for my mom and dad to be married in Virginia as Indians. It was against the law. They were forbidden to give their kids Indian names. And Walter Packer would go to the local registrars, local, clerk's office, and look at how the birth records were recorded. Systematically go through, and what he said, if you had one drop of non-white blood, you were colored. Ironically, Pocahontas came into play because a lot of the FFVs said, well, I'm related to Pocahontas. So that kind of gave some of the Indian folks a free pass. But Walter Packer did, I would have thought irreparable things had come around, damage to people of color within the Commonwealth. I think he was died in 49, I think a bus hit in Richmond, I don't know. Yeah. I think that's what it was. I didn't have my driver's license, so it wasn't me. But we have struggled, and we built our own school. And even in that time, some of the children of folks who hadn't really joined the tribe went to school with us. And, strong alliances were built. One of the tools that the dominant culture used was divide and conquer, and they actually drew a wedge between blacks and Indians when it should have been a strong coalition between those two. But for political gain, that wedge was driven between those two ethnicities, and it took years for some of those wounds to be solved and for the people to come together. In my view, we're all made in God's image, we're all God's people. And I think we have more things in common than we have that would separate us. I think we need to build on that. I think we need to develop relationships that shows the world that Charles City, the United States, that we're people who work together, and if the tide rises, it brings up every one of us, because there's no tether that will hold us down when the water comes up. We need to rise together. We need to work together. If you've ever looked at a time where we need to coalesce and stand up as Americans, it's today when we look at what's going on in Ukraine. It's sad that we didn't do it in 1994 when 800,000 people were killed in West Africa. When that terrible tragedy in Rwanda, and we've got to look out for each other. When I look at what's happened in the tribe, it mirrors what's happened to Indians all over the Southeast and the Northeast. That stain from colonialism, it hurt us to the core. We survived by being obscure, by hiding, by hanging us together, by hunkering down. So now we're not hunkered down anymore. We're out there, and we're trying to reach the thriving mode. We're transitioning from surviving to thriving. As Judah said, I went to school in Oklahoma. However, I didn't go to high school. By the time I finished high school, we did have the 12th grade. And I think I was about sixth in the class. Whoops, there were only 6 people in it. But I did go to Oklahoma to junior college, and I did it mainly because I wanted to feel what those pathfinders did for our people. Lula Shango went to Bacon in 1934. She came back, was Lula Whitehead, and she spent countless hours teaching our kids and inspired many to go to school and obtain higher education. But in 1978, the Chickahominy tribe, the Title IV Indian Education Program here in Charles City. We would take the Indian kids, teach them on Saturday, Friday evenings, march and tramps at the Tribal Center, and then have class again the next day. And Sonia's in the back. That's a time where our kids really got to learn more about who they are and where they came from. And when we came up for renewal of that grant, questions posed, are you federally recognized or state recognized? We thought we were state recognized. I mean, we've been participating in events with the governor and others for many years. And it turned out, according to them, no one in the state, no tribe in the state was state recognized, including the two oldest reservations in the United States. So in '78, I reached out to the General Assembly, and Hardaway Marshall picked up the baton. And we went through 4 years of vigorous, very, very rigorous, I should say, testimonies and research to prove who we are. And I reached out to the Upper Mattapony, the Rappahannock, and the Eastern Chickahominy. And those four tribes gained state recognition in 1983. The Virginia Commission on Indians was established at the same time. And then later, the Nansemond and Monacan gained state recognition through the Virginia Commission on Indians. And that was kind of the springboard to go for federal recognition. And we began that process actually in the 90s in earnest. 1999 we were advised by the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, back then it was called Bureau of Research, EAR. And we were told, you will get federal recognition, but many of you standing before me today will die before it happens. And we lost several chiefs, several tribes lost several chiefs in the interim. But we continued to move ahead. At the same time, we started a process through congressional recognition. And I testified before the House Resources Committee and Senate Committee on Human Affairs many, many times. Turned out we had to wear out some of those people. They had to age out before we got federal recognition. But January 29, 2018, we did gain federal recognition that recognized 6 tribes as sovereign entities within the Commonwealth. If you look back at the Treaty of 1677, it calls us sovereign subjects of the king. Now, it's kind of a contradiction in terms. How can we be both sovereign and subject? But that's what we were called. But we gained federal acknowledgement January 29, 2018. Ironically, I had a meeting with the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, about mid-January 2018, and Lee Flynn said, Chief, I told you folks have what you need for federal recognition. This documentation shows that you're there. And I said, well, if this comes first, we'll take it. If congressional recognition comes first, then that's where we are. And lo and behold, the Senate passed our bill. It went to the president. He signed it January 29th. So stay tuned. We're going to do some great things. We're going to continue to teach people our history. And I hope your lives and your outlook will be greatly enhanced by all that. I thank you for your time and your attention.
Wasn't that enough for those different governmental entities?
So I had a question. The Treaty of 1677, shouldn't that have been enough for us to be recognized by the United States as a governmental entity? And the answer is yes, it should have been. However, those tribes that gained federal recognition were ones that had treaties with the United States. So 1677, the United States wasn't formed. I guess the Constitution was finally ratified in 1789, 1790. So we were, no good deed goes unpunished. We didn't bear arms against the United States, so we didn't need to sign the treaty. The Commonwealth chose to ignore us.
The form of governance was prior to 1981, and the chiefdom, what did you call it?
It was MUNGUY, Mungai. And it went through a process called Huskanaw. And we can talk for days, but you can talk, I can give some background, but it's a very rigorous process. I feel for folks who went through it.
And that was something that had been done since the
Year
thousands of
for
years.
millennium, yes.
I'm curious to know what the tribe's plans are now that you all own land in fee simple. What are you going to do with that land?
Well, it's in process. We haven't really decided. We do plan to engage in some ecotourism where we'll perhaps have folks traveling from a mountain. The property was known as Church Point. The Chickahominy called it a mountain, and on that map that Helen showed, it stands up rather prominently. But we're looking at perhaps putting what we call yehekes or longhouses, and we'll put some on both sides. We'll have primitive camping. And I'm saying this without even having taken it to the tribe. We've talked about it in general terms, but the tribe is interested in that kind of tourism. I mean, that kind of economic development. So we'd like to see something like that so that you can go from the mountain up to, we call it Chickahominy and Powhatan, 105 acres on the James River. And, take tours that we can show those sites on that 20-some mile path of the tribes that we just announced. And I say that tongue in cheek because I'm sure some of those folks survived and they're living somewhere. Expats, they're living without their nation, without their home.
I think we had did you?
Yeah, I do have a question. You mentioned, I think Saturdays were sort of the re-education of your children into the history of.
Yeah, that was, we would have events on Friday night, fashion type activity. On Saturday, there was more arts and crafts and dancing and oral history. Tanya in the back, if you raise your hand, she has taught both of those aspects, the arts and crafts and the dancing.
That's current.
And getting pretty proficient in oral history. We haven't done that since COVID.
Right.
We haven't had a tribal meeting since COVID, and we plan to start those hopefully in the very near term. This is one of the few times you see me in public without a mask. So we took COVID very seriously. We only lost one Chickahominy, and that one he lived in Chicago. But we do have some folks who are suffering with what they call
So I think my question was, how was the history that you learned in school different than like what she's learned?
the history I learned at school was not history. I mean, seriously, it was
So you
fourth
learned-
grade and a couple of pages about the history of Virginia. I met with spoke with the Secretary of Education last week. I met with representatives from the Superintendent of Construction, and what you've seen will change over time, but it's hard to live with the irony is our textbooks, which doesn't give anyone another feeling, are printed and published in Texas. So.
I understand that.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and thank everyone for coming, and especially Dr. Rountree and Stephen Adkins. Let's give them a round of applause.